Alabama, 1908. A young black man named Green Cottenham is walking home along the railroad tracks, the way countless travelers moved through the South, because the road system was primitive and the tracks were simply how you got from one place to another. He is 22 years old. His parents had been born into slavery. He had been born into something the law called freedom. A sheriff's deputy appears on the horizon. Within minutes, Green Cottenham is under arrest. The charge: vagrancy, a crime invented after the Civil War with a definition so broad it could swallow any black man alive: being unemployed, being without papers, being somewhere a white official decided you shouldn't be. Within days, Green Cottenham was sentenced to hard labor. He was leased to the Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Railroad Company, a subsidiary of United States Steel Corporation, one of the most powerful companies in America, and sent into Slope No. 12 of the Pratt mines. He never saw his family again. This was not 1845. This was not before emancipation, before the 13th Amendment, before the Civil War that was supposedly fought to end exactly this. This was 1908, 43 years after Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. 43 years after 4 million black Americans were told they were free. Green Cottenham was a slave, and he was not alone. Here is what you were taught in school. Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. The Union won the Civil War. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. Black Americans were free. And here is what they left out. For decades after that, well into the 20th century, hundreds of thousands of black Americans were forced back into chains through a system so comprehensive, so profitable, and so deliberately designed that even former slave owners admitted it was worse than slavery itself. Not a fringe practice, not isolated incidents. A system built by state governments and major corporations working in open coordination, generating enormous profits, and operating with the full knowledge and frequent participation of federal officials. A system that helped build some of the largest companies in American history. A system that the history books you studied in school chose not to teach you about. This is the story of how slavery never really ended in America. And we're going to tell it in full, because you deserve to know the truth about the country you live in. Before we go any further, I need to tell you why this story is on Hidden Black Files. I built this channel because I grew up learning history that had been carefully edited. Not wrong, exactly, but incomplete in ways that were not accidental. The pieces left out were always the pieces that would force the most uncomfortable questions. The pieces that would make you look at systems differently. The pieces that would make you wonder what else you hadn't been told. The story of convict leasing and debt peonage is one of the most completely omitted chapters in American education. Not because it's obscure. Douglas Blackman won a Pulitzer Prize for his book on this subject. But because if this history were taught honestly, people would demand different answers to questions about racial inequality that are still being asked today. Hidden Black Files exists to tell the stories that make those demands possible. Subscribe right now, hit the bell, and stay with us, because what you're about to hear will change how you understand American history from the Civil War to the present day. April 9, 1865. After 4 years of war that consumed more American lives than any conflict before or since, the Confederate States surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse. 4 million black Americans were free, or so the story goes. The 13th Amendment, ratified in December 1865, abolished slavery and involuntary servitude, with one exception that would prove enormously consequential. Except as punishment for crime whereupon the party shall have been duly convicted. That exception was a door, and the people who had just lost their enslaved labor force walked straight through it. But first, the immediate aftermath looked, briefly, like genuine transformation. The 14th Amendment in 1868 granted citizenship to black Americans. The 15th Amendment in 1870 guaranteed their right to vote. The federal government stationed 38,000 troops across the South to enforce these new constitutional realities. And something extraordinary happened. By 1870, just 5 years after emancipation, over 1,000 black politicians were serving in state and federal offices across the country. Hiram Revels, born to free black parents in North Carolina, took the United States Senate seat that had been held by Jefferson Davis, the former president of the Confederacy. The man who had led the nation that enslaved millions now had his seat occupied by a black man making laws for the nation that had defeated him. Blanche K. Bruce, born into slavery in Virginia, joined Revels as the second black U.S. Senator. Here is a question we want you to answer in the comments, and we mean this genuinely. Why do you think this period, when black Americans were winning elections and serving in Congress just 5 years after emancipation, is not the version of Reconstruction that most Americans learn? What does the decision to not teach this tell us? Drop your answer below. We'll be reading them. The plantation owners had a problem. Their entire economic system, every dollar of wealth they possessed, every social position they held, every political arrangement they had built, rested on a foundation of enslaved labor. That foundation was now, legally, gone. They needed a replacement, and they were prepared to be creative. Their first move was the labor contract. Former slave owners would present freed black men and women with elaborate documents, contracts that claimed to represent fair employment arrangements, promising wages and reasonable conditions. What the contracts actually contained, written in legal language that most freed people, who had been legally forbidden from learning to read, could not parse, were conditions that were slavery with additional paperwork. Workers could be locked in cells at night, chained, forbidden from leaving the property without permission, required to accept physical punishment at the employer's discretion, required to conduct themselves in what the contracts called a servile manner. The wages, when they existed, were often offset against fees for housing, food, and clothing provided by the employer. Fees that were set by the employer, at whatever level the employer chose, making it mathematically impossible for many workers to ever accumulate enough to leave. A former enslaved woman named Patsy Mitchner, interviewed in 1937, described the transition with a clarity that no academic language has ever improved on. Slavery was a bad thing, and freedom of the kind we got, with nothing to live on, was bad too. 2 snakes full of poison, one lying with his head pointing north, the other with his head pointing south. Their names were slavery and freedom. Both bit the Negro, and they were both bad. Both snakes, one named slavery, one named freedom, and the one named freedom was about to bare its fangs. 1876. The presidential election was contested. Republican Rutherford B. Hayes and Democrat Samuel Tilden both claiming victory, the outcome genuinely uncertain. Southern Democrats saw the leverage the moment provided. They struck a deal. They would accept Hayes as president. In exchange, all federal troops would be withdrawn from the South. The soldiers who had made Reconstruction possible, who had made black political participation possible, who had provided the physical presence that backed the new constitutional amendments with something more than ink on paper, would leave. And just like that, they were gone. In 1877, Hayes ordered the final withdrawal. Radical Reconstruction was over. The South was free to do what it had been planning to do since the moment the war ended. With federal troops gone, Southern state legislatures moved with remarkable speed and coordination to build what historians now call the Black Codes, a comprehensive legal architecture designed to criminalize black existence itself. Not specific black behaviors, not specific black actions, black existence. In practice, this meant laws that made it nearly impossible for a black person to move through daily life without being technically in violation of something. Walking along railroad tracks. The primary way to travel in a region with almost no paved roads was trespassing. Boarding a freight train without a ticket was a crime. Carrying a razor, a tool any working man or barber might reasonably carry, could result in arrest. Vagrancy laws made unemployment itself a crime. If you could not prove you were employed by an employer who would vouch for you, you could be arrested. If you had just left an abusive employer, or been laid off, or were between jobs, you were a criminal. And here is the critical element that made this system so effective. Once arrested, you faced an all-white jury. You had no right to legal representation. And the person deciding your fate was often not a trained judge, but what they called a justice of the peace, which could be your local innkeeper, your local grocer, or the plantation owner who ran the farm you had just tried to leave. Your boss could also be your judge. The system needed a purpose beyond control. It needed a profit motive. And it found one: convict leasing. The arrangement was straightforward in its brutality. State governments would arrest black citizens on these manufactured charges, convict them in these rigged proceedings, sentence them to hard labor, and then lease their labor to private companies for a fee. The state got revenue. The company got workers who could not quit, could not organize, could not demand wages, and could be beaten or worked to death with no legal consequence. The prisoner got nothing but survival, and often not even that. Let's look at what this meant in practice. The Chattahoochee Brick Company in Atlanta, Georgia, under the blazing Georgia sun, forced convict laborers to produce 300,000 bricks every single day. 300,000. The work was so brutal, and the conditions so dangerous, that children were specifically sought out for certain tasks, because their small bodies could fit inside the superheated kilns where adult workers could not. Children, inside burning kilns, producing bricks for one of America's most profitable construction companies. The company's owner, James W. English, was a former Confederate officer. He became one of Atlanta's wealthiest and most respected men. The bricks that literally rebuilt Atlanta after the Civil War were produced by enslaved black children in his furnaces. In Alabama's coal mines, the Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Railroad Company, which would eventually become part of United States Steel, ran a system with an annual death rate at some mines of 30%. 30%. If you sentenced 100 men to work in the Coalburg mine, 30 of them would be dead within 12 months. One death every 12 days. And unlike the antebellum slave system, where enslaved people represented significant capital investment and slave owners had financial incentive to keep them alive, convict lessees had no such incentive. When a convict laborer died, you simply requested another one from the state. Human beings, replaced like broken tools. Here is something that requires you to stop and really sit with it. Before the Civil War, many Northern observers described Black Americans as hardworking, loyal, and reliable. The propaganda necessary to sustain slavery had not fully penetrated Northern culture. Northerners who had not grown up in a slave society had not been subjected to the same ideological architecture. By 1900, just 35 years after emancipation, the dominant narrative about Black Americans had completely transformed. Words like brute, thug, and savage had replaced hardworking and reliable in Northern newspaper coverage. This was not organic cultural evolution. This was a deliberate campaign. The lost cause narrative. The Southern reframing of the Civil War as a noble struggle for states' rights and traditional values rather than a defense of slavery had been spreading through the North via textbooks, newspapers, literature, and eventually film. By 1915, when D.W. Griffith released Birth of a Nation, a film that portrayed the Confederacy's defeat as a tragedy and the Ku Klux Klan as heroes protecting civilization, the transformation of the national narrative was essentially complete. President Woodrow Wilson screened the film at the White House and called it, in a phrase that should permanently disqualify him from any honorable mention in American history, history written with lightning. The Klan, which had been effectively suppressed in the 1870s, saw a massive revival directly attributable to the film's influence. Birth of a Nation even invented the burning cross, a symbol the original Klan had never used, which the revived Klan adopted from the movie and made its most recognizable image. The myth of black criminality, manufactured to justify convict leasing, had escaped its original context and become a national ideology. We have a question for the comments, and this one matters. Birth of a Nation was screened at the White House in 1915 and credited with reviving the KKK. Do you think a president showing a film with that kind of impact should affect how we evaluate their historical legacy? What do you think? By the 1890s, the numbers revealed the system's true nature with a clarity that should have been impossible to deny. In Alabama alone, a state survey of convicts in the coal mining region found the most common charges were carrying a concealed weapon, gambling, using offensive language, and, the most common of all, vagrancy, being black and unemployed. In 1890, Alabama's official records showed convicts imprisoned for crimes, including selling cotton after sunset, speaking too loudly in the presence of white women, quitting their job, 7 men imprisoned for the crime of interracial relationships, 24 imprisoned for using obscene language, and perhaps most revealing of all, the largest category of convict laborers in Alabama's Pratt mines was listed simply as not given. They didn't write down the crime. They didn't bother, because there was no crime. The crime was being black in Alabama. The crime was being available for leasing. The crime was that a coal company needed workers, and a justice of the peace needed to fill his quota. By 1898, convict leasing had become so integral to Alabama's economy that nearly 73% of the entire state's revenue came from leasing convicts. 73%. The state of Alabama was, functionally, running a slave labor operation as its primary industry. And major corporations, U.S. Steel, Tennessee Coal and Iron, Chattahoochee Brick, were the customers. Now let's talk about scale. Because the individual stories, Green Cottenham, John Davis, Alfred Irving, as devastating as they are, can obscure the magnitude of what this system actually was. Over 800,000 people were caught in this system of neo-slavery. 800,000. That is approximately 20% of all the people freed by the Emancipation Proclamation. 1 in 5. The South had re-enslaved 1 in 5 of the people it had been legally required to free, using the courts, the police, the legislature, and the private sector working together as a single machine. And they did it completely legally. Here is the story of John Davis, because the mechanics of how this happened to individual human beings need to be understood, not just the aggregate numbers. 1901 Alabama. John Davis is walking down a road. His wife is dying. He is trying to reach her bedside. A local constable claims Davis owes him money. That is the entire basis for what happens next. Davis is arrested. He never makes it to his wife. He is processed through the justice of the peace system, convicted and leased into the debt peonage system, a variation of convict leasing that used manufactured debt rather than criminal conviction as its entry point. The mechanics of debt peonage deserve careful attention because they were ingeniously designed to be self-perpetuating. You would be arrested on a manufactured charge. A kind plantation owner or company representative would offer to pay your fine, typically small, perhaps $10, in exchange for a work contract. What the contract did not explain clearly was the accounting system attached to it. Every meal you ate was added to your debt. Every piece of clothing provided was added to your debt. Every night's lodging was added to your debt. The prices for these necessities were set by the employer, at whatever level the employer chose. The more you worked, the more you somehow owed. Federal prosecutor Warren Reese investigated these operations in 1903 and described what he found. These violations have not been confined to 1 or 2 periodical and independent instances, but have developed into a miserable business and custom to catch up ignorant and helpless Negro men and women upon the flimsiest and most baseless charges. The victims would be placed into a condition of involuntary servitude, locked up at nights in a cell, worked under guards during the day from 3 in the morning until 7 or 8 at night, whipped in a most cruel manner, insufficiently fed or poorly clad, and if you tried to escape, dogs were set on your trail. When caught, the contract was reset. The cycle began again. When contracts neared their end and escape seemed possible, workers would suddenly be arrested again on new charges. The system was designed to be permanent. When companies were occasionally brought to court, when the rarest of circumstances produced a legal challenge to these practices, they deployed a defense that was stunning in its audacity. They argued, since the debts used to hold workers were fictitious, this wasn't debt peonage. It was slavery. And since the 13th Amendment had abolished slavery, but had not made slavery a crime, they were technically not violating any law. They were right. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. It did not criminalize it. No federal statute made enslaving someone a prosecutable offense. And so the courts, following the logic of the law as written, allowed the system to continue. This is not a footnote. This is a foundational fact about the legal architecture of post-Civil War America. The country that fought a war over slavery did not bother to make slavery illegal. December 7, 1941. Japan attacks Pearl Harbor. America enters World War II. And in the Roosevelt administration's war planning meetings, someone raises an uncomfortable question. What will the enemy use against us in the propaganda war? The answer was obvious. How could the United States claim moral superiority over Japan's treatment of the Chinese and Korean people? How could America position itself as the defender of human dignity against fascist oppression, while maintaining a domestic system of forced black labor that had been operating in various forms for 76 years since emancipation? The answer was, it couldn't. Just 5 days after Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt's Justice Department issued Circular 3591. This memo fundamentally reframed how federal prosecutors were instructed to approach these cases. For decades, prosecutions had failed because companies argued they were operating under debt contracts, that this wasn't peonage, it was simply aggressive debt collection. The Justice Department told prosecutors, stop calling it peonage. Call it what it is. Involuntary servitude. Slavery. The word that had been carefully avoided in legal proceedings for decades was now the official prosecutorial framework. And it worked. Within months, dozens of cases were opened across the South. The machinery of the federal court system, the same system that had been used to perpetuate this slavery for decades, was finally being turned against it. But it took a world war and a propaganda problem to make that happen. Not moral clarity. Not legal principle, a propaganda problem. September 1942. Federal agents arrive at a farm outside Beeville, Texas. On the property of a family named Scroggs Bartk, they find a man named Alfred Irving. He has been held as a slave, not a contracted laborer, not a debt peon, but a slave in every complete sense of the word, for at least 4 years. He has been starved. He has been beaten with chains, whips, and ropes. The injuries are permanent. His body carries the evidence of what was done to him. The Scroggs Bart family was prosecuted, convicted, and sentenced to federal prison. Alfred Irving became the last chattel slave to be freed in America. Not in 1865. Not in 1870. Not at the turn of the century. In 1942. We want you to hold that date for a moment, and we genuinely want to hear your response in the comments. The last slave in America was freed in 1942. Joe Biden was born 2 months later. Ruth Bader Ginsburg was 9 years old. Your grandparents or great-grandparents were alive. Does knowing the actual end date of American slavery, 1942, not 1865, change how you think about racial inequality today? Tell us honestly. And yet, the liberation of Alfred Irving did not end the story. It ended one chapter. The next chapter had already begun. In 1964, the Civil Rights Act. In 1965, the Voting Rights Act. Finally, 95 years after the 15th Amendment had theoretically guaranteed it, Black Americans had meaningful legal access to the ballot. And then, In 1971, President Nixon launched the War on Drugs. Years later, Nixon's domestic policy chief, John Ehrlichman, one of the key architects of that campaign, gave an interview that should be required reading in every American history classroom. He said, "The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black. But by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities." He admitted it. On the record, the war on drugs was not a public health initiative. It was a counterintelligence operation targeting black communities and political opponents. It was the Black Codes, updated for the television era. Look at the pattern: slave codes, which criminalized black freedom of movement and required black people to have white sponsors to exist in public space. Black codes, which criminalized vagrancy, unemployment, and the ordinary activities of daily life to funnel black people into convict leasing. The war on drugs, which targeted black communities with enforcement practices that treated identical behavior differently depending on the race of the person engaged in it. The methods changed. The results stayed the same. Here is what this history actually explains, and what its absence from American education is specifically designed to prevent you from understanding. The question that is asked most frequently about racial inequality in America, in newspaper op-eds, in political debates, in casual conversations, is some version of this. Slavery ended 150 years ago. Why haven't black Americans caught up? The answer, as you now know, is built into the false premise of the question. Slavery did not end 150 years ago. It ended 80 years ago. And in the decades between 1865 and 1942, the system did not simply fail to help black Americans build wealth and stability. It actively, systematically, and profitably extracted whatever wealth and stability black Americans managed to build. The convict leasing system did not just imprison people. It destroyed families. It took men from their children during the years those children needed them most. It broke the continuity of communities that had survived slavery and were trying to build something on the other side of it. The debt peonage system did not just steal labor. It created generational terror, a well-founded, evidence-based understanding that the legal system was not designed to protect you, that law enforcement was not your ally, that the institutions of government viewed you as a resource to be extracted rather than a citizen to be served. We want to end with a direct question, the most important one we've asked today. Knowing that slavery in America ended in 1942, not 1865, and knowing that the war on drugs was explicitly designed to target black communities, what do you think an honest accounting of this history would require from the country? What would justice actually look like? Tell us in the comments. We want to know what you think. We read every single comment on this channel, because the people who watch Hidden Black Files are not passive consumers of information. They are people who understand that knowing this history carries a responsibility to think more clearly, to ask harder questions, and to refuse the sanitized version of American history that was designed to make the current arrangement seem natural and inevitable. This story, from Green Cottenham and the Pratt mines to Alfred Irving in Texas, to John Ehrlichman's confession about the war on drugs, is a single connected story. A century-long system of extracting value from black lives using whatever legal tools were available at the time. Understanding it does not just explain the past. It explains the present, and that is exactly why it isn't taught. Hidden Black Files exists because the truth deserves to be told. Because the people whose lives were consumed by these systems deserve to have their stories known. Because you deserve to understand the actual history of the country you live in. Subscribe. Share this video. Leave a comment with your answer to the questions we've asked, or with whatever this history stirred in you. Because if we don't tell these stories, they disappear. And if they disappear, the systems they explain survive unchallenged. Hidden black files exists, so that never happens.